Welcome, everyone. We're back for another episode of the Dishing on Division III Women's Basketball podcast. I'm Scott Peterson, not joined by Riley at the moment, as he is trying to figure out Wi-Fi during the almost end of the SCAC women's title game down in Texas. But we are joined by some guests today, and our first guest is Justin Heinzen. Justin was a longtime coach of the Loras, is it college, Justin?
It is, yeah.
Of the Loras College women's basketball team, spent many years on Iraq, 2 years as an assistant at Lakeland, and you went to Wisconsin Lutheran yourself and live in Dubuque. Welcome, Justin.
Good to be back.
I'm curious, now that you are relatively less involved in basketball than you have been, what are some things you miss about it, and what are ways that you are staying connected to the Division III basketball scene?
I miss building a team. That was the fun part. I think the games and results were always a byproduct of that, and there's always regardless of expectations, I think the fun part was taking a team and trying to build them to march, and the challenge behind that, regardless of how talented or what everybody thought you were going to do. Miss the culture piece a lot, but I'm still fairly connected. I had a decent, not expansive, but coaching tree, and went to Ripon last night to watch them play, as Lauren was my assistant for quite a while, and so I still have ties to the game that way, and a little bit of stake in it there. Certainly, it's nice to be able to watch somebody but Loras all the time too, because when you're in it, you're very much consumed by your own. So, sure, able to watch a lot more Midwest since the last 2 years for sure.
I had a question. Since you coached for such a long stretch of time, how much would the required coaching around the culture piece stay the same or need to change? And then the same sort of question about the kind of basketball schematics or style of team that you want it to be.
I'll start with basketball. I don't know if we were unique, but I think we approached it a lot differently. Our men's staff give me hell about this every year, but we would change offensively and defensively every single thing about our team because our personnel changed, and we didn't run the same offense or run the same defense rarely consecutive years in a row. So that was always a fun, and it kept us as a staff up to speed as well. Like, what's the latest? But how can we put our players in the best spot to succeed and not pigeonhole them in what we think a cool offense is? Culture-wise, there's no book on that. I think the foundation stuff stayed the same, but situationally, there's so much that happens, and the trust always stayed the same. Though you can't move forward without it, and a lot of hard conversations that early on in my career I was really afraid to have, I think, and ironically, as we got competitive and good on the national scene, those conversations we welcomed from a player end and a coaching end. So culture piece, there wasn't, like I said, there wasn't a book for that, and there wasn't a one size fits all. It was always evolving, but I feel like that was always a standard, although super challenging, as I'm sure many coaches would relate to sustain, because it's not human nature. We had a big roster. We had 30 on our team, and everybody wants to play, and Brad Fisher was on a podcast a little while back, and from Oshkosh, and he's got maybe 14 All-State kids on his roster, and you almost feel bad for not playing kids, but the competitor in us wants to play and reach for that next level always. And as a coaching staff, you're trying to put the best product on the floor, cognizant of how people feel about that too. So that was a challenge.
Yeah, that's one thing I always wonder when you see a big transfer. Move teams is usually that can push down minutes at the team that they're joining,
Right.
and that seems like a potential like big thing that a coach has to manage and be aware of.
Yeah, we went through
So,
that with Sammy
go ahead.
Martin. We had our last All-American. She came in from Bradley, a Division One school, and uh, obviously was one of the best players on the floor at all times. But that changes a lot of dynamics within the team, and team has to be ready for that and embrace that as well. So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to it for sure.
Well, we are now joined by our other guest, Megan Wilson. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks for having me. How are you guys?
We are doing well. I have never met you before, Megan, but great to have you on the show. You are a quick bio on Megan. Probably won't hit every bullet here, but you currently serve as the Associate Dean of Student Engagement and Intercollegiate Athletics at the University of Dubuque. And you attended Wisconsin Stevens Point and won a national championship there. And then spent time coaching, and most recently was the chair of the Women's Basketball National Committee. And you were on the committee as a whole for 6 years. So I feel unqualified to be interviewing anyone, but wildly long number of years in Division III for both of you. Can I jump right into some logistical questions around Selection Sunday, Megan?
You sure can.
From your experience, as the committee is starting to get a handle on most of the field, if not all of it, at kind of this point in the day, is there a way that the bracket starts being made? Typically, has there been lots of draft brackets made? Do you throw up ones first? Do you figure out your kind of island or tougher geographic teams first?
Yeah, I think obviously this year looks quite a bit different for the committee, I'm guessing, than it has previously. And so we would definitely, I think a few years ago with the reveal of the top 16, that kind of helped us start thinking about who those potential 16 host sites could be. And then, we would get a few of us on the committee. So now there's 10 regions, and that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen at times when you're trying to build a bracket. And so, I think a lot of times we've kind of gotten some heat about what that looks like, or, how coaches who are in the mix or, are in the NCAA tournament step out for that part of the process. But so we would generally start with those administrators or coaches who will not be a part of the NCAA tournament bracket. And then we start to build some things knowing that, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, everything can kind of blow up. So we would be touching base for a few hours at a time. It starts kind of with top 16 reveal. And then the week before Selection Sunday, we're kind of touching base. Tuesday was normally rack call. Wednesday was national call. And previously before MPI, those national calls would take 3-4 hours sometimes just to make sure we were getting things right across the board. And then really start to focus on bracketing Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
One question I had around regional rankings is there's that final week of regional rankings done before selections are made. What sort of timeline is there between the conclusion of conference championship games? I imagine the racks are involved, and then setting that final regional ranking.
So all the regions would have their final rack call usually Sunday morning. And so obviously some of those games are not completed by that point. So they're going through what if scenarios, and the more games on Sunday, the more what if scenarios. I remember one time when Polly Thomason was on the rack in the South, I think they had like 16 what if scenarios that the committee had to go through. And so you go through those, and then on Sunday, we generally start, around noon, and you start with those regions that have all their games completed and go through those. And then you just kind of wait as games come in to finalize those regional rankings from those regions that have conference championships on Sundays.
That makes sense that if you're not going to have the racks like on a perpetual call all Sunday, that they kind of have to complete that what if scenario in hopefully a limited number of games. So let's take a quick break because we have gotten some results. So Gettysburg and Johns Hopkins are in overtime in the Centennial Conference. Both of those teams are going to be in the NCAA tournament, but I believe if Gettysburg wins, they will be a top 8 seed. If Gettysburg loses, I think Randolph-Macon is going to be a top 8 seed. Actually, no, Randolph-Macon would be a top 8 seed. It's around the end of 16 that does have some implications here, as Catholic might be a front runner above Christopher Newport, but there are still some switchings that can go on in the top 16 there, even though, again, the top 16 seeds are not guaranteed to host. I imagine the committee would try to have them host unless there were other requirements that needed fulfilling. So that's the Centennial. I think Smith is going to hold on here over MIT. They are up 9 with 34 seconds left. So that would be good news for Wisconsin lacrosse and Wisconsin Stevens Point. And then Texas Lutheran has beaten Trinity, Texas. So I think that puts Stevens Point to 100% chance to be in the tournament. And then lacrosse is just going to wait on the final 30 seconds of Smith MIT because I don't think Vassar versus Ithaca will impact the end of the Pool C picture. So we might be just about done. Am I able to? I am able to add a stage. So we got Smith. We'll just highlight Texas Lutheran for now. But I think pending the end of Smith, that these are your unofficial teams in the tournament, which would be the same order or almost the same order that they were in at the end of last night. It just means that Stevens Point lacrosse, I think, will be in. I'll need to add in these final results and just reconfirm, but I really wasn't seeing any other Pool C percentage for teams below lacrosse. It was just on if Bid Thieves took any away. So she will go back there. What other questions did I have for? So is there something that you can talk about with regards to once you start bracketing, Megan? Like, do you start with the 1 seeds? Do you start with island regions? Or do you go region by region?
Yeah, I think we, in the last few years, we've really tried to protect those top seeds. And so we kind of start with those. Obviously, you always have to have kind of in the back of your head region 10 and which of those teams have qualified for either at-large or Pool C contention. And so I think different than previous years, right? The MPI kind of now gives us a national rank, essentially, and we didn't really have that before. And so I think when you're going through, you're trying to protect those top teams and not just the top 4, right? The top 8, and kind of thinking about what that looks like. Not only first weekend, but second weekend. And, you have to think about the implications of the hosting priorities with the men's bracket and what that looks like. But I think what we've really tried to do, like the last 3 years. So I was the chair, and then I was on one more year after I was the chair. And what we really tried to do is, create as much of a national bracket as we possibly could, knowing that there's going to be travel restrictions and implications in place. And what I mean by that is, let's say teams in Region 9 are going to play teams in Region 9, right? Like that's what happened. And, so how can we build a pod with maybe a Region 7, a Region 8, a Region 9, and a 6 possibly, and kind of really stretch that 500 miles. The other thing you really have to look at and think about is, the NCAA gives the 500 miles, but you're also thinking about what sort of experience that creates for the student athletes, and, getting on a bus for 500 miles. Now, I think some would argue I would prefer to travel a distance and make it really feel like an NCAA tournament versus, for example, the Loris men last year went up to UW Platteville, and you're going 25 miles. Maybe some people see that great. The guys are sleeping in their own beds and, but does that really feel like an NCAA championship experience, or does that just feel like another non-conference game? Now, environment obviously impacts that, but, those are all things you're kind of thinking about. We're also really taking a look at matchups from the previous bracket, so we'll look back a couple of years and we sent this team there, or these guys were in the same pod, and try to avoid that a little bit if you can, just again, to just create as much of a national tournament as possible within the confines of travel and Division III budgets.
It makes a lot of sense. Do you think that in past years, when there were no technical 1 through 64 overall seeds, do you think the committee could maybe have been more flexible at putting together a national bracket where maybe the 1 through 16 seed didn't line up perfectly the way that you might see it in a D1 tournament? That now under MPI, some people might be very angry if the overall 55 seed ends up with an easier game than the overall 52 seed. Do you think there might be less flexibility for the committee to optimize some other things because those exact differences in MPI are known?
Yeah, I think for sure that's going to be an issue. Just like, I've been talking to colleagues about like protecting those top 16, right? Like, and that was part of the reveal of the top 16 that we were worried about as a committee. And I think it's even more magnified now that you have MPI because it goes deeper than that. But, just because they're the top 16 does not guarantee them a hosting spot. Number one, they had to have put in to host, and there's geographic implications and how many teams in the Midwest can really host, and so some are out on the East Coast, some of those things. So I think we definitely had a little bit more flexibility because there wasn't that true 1 through 64. And now you kind of see that. And so I think, Division III basketball fans kind of have to decide, what's more important, what's doable in the Division III landscape, really, because we're not going to have a true 1 through 64 perfectly seeded bracket. We're not going to see that tomorrow.
Right. We will definitely not. And within the constraints, that's a good thing. One example to bring up. So this was a mock bracket made by Matt Snyder this morning for the women's side. So across the top, I think will be your top 4 overall seeds: Bowdoin, NYU, Scranton, and Baldwin-Wallace. Doesn't mean that the 2 left quadrants being next to each other doesn't mean anything. Looks like they are ordered 1, 2, 3, 4, but it doesn't indicate where they would be specifically in the entire bracket. One thing that I'm always looking at when I see these mock brackets is the top seeds in each of the quadrants. And so you can start with Bowdoin and just say if Catholic, Smith, and Gustavus all get through, I believe an equal number of teams can get to Bowdoin or to anywhere else. And so there's no reason to not host that sectional at the top seed. But as you go across, you see like Gustavus there. The winner of that pod would have to fly to whoever. So it almost kind of becomes a wild card where it's not really in play for sectional. You look at the NYU quadrant, Carnegie Mellon, Hopkins, and Macon. Those are all pretty flexible high seeds. And then moving on to Scranton, you have Ohio Wesleyan, Gettysburg, which are also very flexible, but then Whitman, which is not. And then over on the right, Baldwin-Wallace, Wartburg, Oshkosh, and Illinois Wesleyan. I don't believe Oshkosh can get to Baldwin-Wallace.
Really? Maybe they were out in, were they at Northern last year?
Yeah, they were.
Oshkosh. And Baldwin. 514.
Oof.
And so in that scenario, it could be that Illinois Wesleyan would host if chalk went through, because I think Baldwin Wallace can get there, and Oshkosh and Wartburg can as well. So that would be a 0 bus scenario versus a 1 bus scenario to go to Baldwin Wallace. And so whenever the bracket comes up, like, I have no idea how the committee is going to create each of the quadrants this year, but once the bracket comes out, like, you will be able to figure those things out clearly, that if they are going to minimize flights when selecting sectionals, that in this scenario, Illinois Wesleyan would have a better chance than Baldwin Wallace probably to host that sectional. But I'm curious to see how New York University is bracketed with respect to the 3 other top teams in their quadrant, because with the men's team being strong, you could treat it as likely that the men are hosting sectionals and thus the women can't. But if you make too much of an assumption on that and are wrong, and you've created a situation where it is fewer flights to send NYU on the road in the sectionals, that would also be probably a poor outcome. And so I will definitely be looking to see where NYU, who's with NYU. Since the men's bracket is going to be announced first, we might get some clues there, as it would be a shocker if Illinois Wesleyan men, NYU men, or Macon are hosting in opening weekend. That would indicate some large happenings in the women's bracket. So that is that from Matt Snyder.
Looks like Gettysburg's getting through here. 16 seconds left, up 7, and they're shooting free throws.
So if Gettysburg gets through, they would lock down a top 8 seed, I believe. So Gettysburg was already ahead in my chances. And this is just likely going to confirm that they will be top 8. I'm trying to find my other window. There it is. Perfect. What were you usually up to on a weekend like this, Justin? I don't know if there were both weekends where you knew that you were in the tournament, you knew that you were out, and you were unsure.
I don't know. Calm before the storm sort of thing. You could go through teams that you might play, but does it pay to work through a 4-hour scout on a Sunday night on a guess? So I'd watch D3 hoops. I don't know if we were ever like last team in scenario, and we had more at large than AQs anyway. But I think with whatever data was out there or that I was on rack, I think we always had a pretty good feel that we had a pretty good resume for it. So I think we sweated once, but I was never on the wrong side of that, which is a good thing. So it was probably of the week ahead, the most relaxed night, I would say.
Megan, do you have any thoughts on NPI's application to the women's sport this first year, and any thoughts on how it might have impacted the time that you were on the committee as well as being chair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's too early to tell, right? Like, I don't think we will ever have a perfect system. And so, like, over the years that I served on the committee, I think it was talked a lot about how the priorities of the committee changed. Maybe when I first got on, the women's committee was very heavy, relied on win-loss percentage. I thought as my time came to a close, that was more balanced, and looking at strength of schedule and results versus ranked and quality wins. And so I think MPI probably definitely saves a lot of time. Obviously, I had a lot of conversations with the committee this year and just, what that looks like. I being on the rack and being on the national committee was some of the best professional development years of my life. Like I'd still be on the women's basketball committee if they wouldn't have kicked me off. So I loved it. It was a way for me to stay tied to the game, and it's something I'm really interested in. Obviously, I was affected as a student athlete by an at-large, and just kind of that impact, and all of those things are just really impactful in my career. And so, I think just trying to figure out the dials and what's right. The problem is, you say, let's say they're going to leave them for 2 to 3 years, and then coaches are just starting to get it figured out for scheduling purposes, right? And then we decide to tweak them for whatever reason. And so what does that cycle look like? I know when we were going through the testing phase, it was really hard for us to feel like we got everybody in that we thought should have been in, if that makes sense. So there might have been a team with a really high win-loss percentage that, because it was past data, we knew did not have success in the NCAA tournament, and it didn't matter what we did to the dials. They were ranked pretty high in MPI, and so I think that was something that was kind of unavoidable. And I just think it was really fast, right? Again, not that I don't think it's been right, but I just thought it was a push to let's get this done and we're going to implement it now. And I'm not really sure we really had an understanding of the implications and what that meant for scheduling. And I don't think coaches had a clear understanding of how it was going to impact some of these decisions.
Do you have any thoughts as well, Justin? It probably was impacting you not at all or less directly, but you can still kind of imagine what kind of impact it would have had on you.
Yeah, I will. I was going back and forth with Riley yesterday about it. It'll be different. Not having a watch party wondering, right? I thought that was always we were on the good side of it, but I thought that was always an awesome feeling. And if going into Monday that you're in, and I think that experience is different for sure. But like Megan said, I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect system for it. It's just how can we improve it always? And but that watch party thing, there's something about that. Sitting on the edge of your seat waiting for that last team, or we always knew if another team was called ahead of us that we were higher than, we felt good. But that experience is pretty cool. And I think you lose a little bit of that now.
Yeah, I think you definitely lose a lot of that. And the way that I've tried to think through it is, in almost every area of your life, you would rather know where you stand than have that be less known to you. Even if there's excitement once you find out it's the good side of it. If we can know and let people know all year where they stand, I think that's better than potentially subjective opinions shifting somewhat and changing someone's fortune there. But I think you're right that there is an experience that's lost.
And Megan brought up a really good point. Like, coaches schedule 2 years out, and to change the dial at all is going to change scheduling a little bit, or I think so. Transparency moving forward as early as possible will help coaches out a lot, because a lot of time you're pigeonholed into what you've already done scheduling wise, and that does move pretty far out in the calendar.
I think that it's going to be interesting to see what incentives MPI does have for scheduling. The things that I'm guessing we'll see is that your more disparate geographic teams, really from Region 10, might have a hard time booking 25 regular season Division 3 games. Because a lot of times I think teams were flying to them for the hope of an RRO matchup. Whereas now there's no RRO or not regionally ranked. And so finding NPI team 120 closer to you than NPI team 115, 2,000 miles away, I think can lessen the incentive to travel to a Region 10 team. And because of the existence of the minimum wins threshold at 15, if you're playing 22 regular season games and then a couple conference tournament games, it's just fewer opportunities for you to get enough wins to get above 15 and drop your worst ones. And if you're not confident on being able to drop 2, 3, 4, 5 of your worst wins, then you've got to be really, really careful with how you schedule non-conference. And I think that will affect Region 10 teams negatively if they cannot fill their schedules with 25 games. And then I think it could hit your really top teams, because there's not really any point now to schedule a top team if you think your chances of winning it are really low. You're not going to take the NPI hit if you lose to, say, NYU. Merchant Marine didn't take a large hit from losing to NYU, but they also gave up the opportunity to add a win and potentially drop a low counting win. And so I just wonder how much non-conference teams are going to say, yeah, I'd like to go play a non-conference game against NYU, Bowdoin, Hope, Illinois Wesleyan, Scranton. I think some of those teams might struggle to or might have less pick of opponents than they have in the past. So I'm definitely interested to see how that impacts Hope, because they usually have a weak bottom of the conference. And if strong teams around don't want to play Hope as much because there's less, well, actually, no. If it would be more middling teams might be less willing to come play Hope. Hope may be left to decide, like, do we just book a bunch of other really elite teams in the region or in the geography, or take what you can get? Because if you're, trying to get in on the fringes of Pool C, I don't think it makes sense to knowingly schedule a top 5 team, just because the opportunity cost of that loss will hurt you. But I think in a lot of ways it'll be helpful, because because of RROs going away, it doesn't matter if the team that you booked ended up 75th or 65th overall. You're getting their NPI value, and their specific strength affects you. Their specific strength changing year to year affects a team less that has already scheduled them. But yeah, so 2 years out usually, Justin, and actually you can answer too, Megan. 2 years. So, like, would you assume that 90% or 95% of non-conference games for next year are booked?
Minus like teams that back out late, yeah. I also think looking at like a schedule of lacrosse and a schedule that Tufts had, I think if you have a team that could make a run, and you're meddling in that 60, 70, 80 range, there's no hurt to schedule a bunch of top 50s.
Yes.
Lacrosse 16 and 11 probably going to get in. And I think if I counted right, they played 13 teams that won 18 games or more. And I think they won 4 of them. So
I believe,
if you want to go for it, you can.
This was true at least before last night, but lacrosse had the most wins against NPI top 25 teams in the nation. They had 4. And so NPI will absolutely provide that reward if you beat a top team. And actually, we got a question, which is what would NPI versus the old system have looked like? And again, I did not go and break I did not consider head-to-head or common opponents, but we can look at what that difference would have been. So we would have had the same roughly first 15 Pool C teams, but Bridgewater, Virginia would have been next up at 808, 532, 1 and 3. They would have gotten in. Mary Hardin Baylor and St. Norbert would have also gotten in. And then the 3 teams that would have been out, actually, that is right. The 3 teams that would have been out would be Trinity, Connecticut, Bates, and Stevens Point. And if you notice, like all 3 of those teams are under 700 winning percentage, and you usually had to have a pretty stacked rest of the resume to get in with a sub 700 winning percentage. But NPI is like, hey, we don't care about that necessarily. We're just going to look at the result of each game and provide you a value from that. And in Bridgewater's case, that 532 SOS, I think, is actually weaker than it looks because they lost most of the difficult games on their schedule. And that was just, I heard someone describe what the committees were doing before is they had blunt tools. And so you could look at, I don't think you could look at Bridgewater's entire schedule. But you don't really have a sense if the 808 and the 532 are made up, if that 808 is made up of, well, they beat all the bottom teams on their schedule and lost to the top 4, or if that 532 is driven by 2 elite teams that they played and lost to, or if it's built by playing that sort of level of team throughout the entire year. But MPI is able to do that because it can say, hey, we know who you lost to, we know who you beat, and we can try to work out a ranking there. But do either of you have thoughts looking at kind of this rough comparison of a potential old system and what MPI is spitting out?
Megan, go ahead.
I think there's always going to be some of this, right? Like, I think that the old system, obviously there was a little bit more subjectivity. And so like, even when we talk about results versus ranked, I think men's versus women might have looked at that differently. So like if a team was 4-2 results versus ranked, we would break down who those 4 wins were against and who those 2 losses were against. And, then there's also a discussion is number 1 equal across the board? Probably not, right? Like, so some number 1s in different regions. And so there's just a little bit more subjectivity, which doesn't make it right. And, I think that's one of the pros of MPIs. It takes out that human element a little bit. Some people might always also see that as a negative to the MPI is, the eye test or some of the things that that the computer does not take into account. So, but the old system was supposed to try to remove that as much as possible, right? Like it was really supposed to be about the primary criteria and the secondary when splitting hairs. So, I'm happy for my alma mater getting in with the MPI. I'll say that.
It shows that they have beaten a lot of really strong teams. If at a 692 winning percentage, they were the second one from the last in, so they weren't even the last one in. And if you just eyeball up that list, you can see Ohio Northern at a 704, 574, so better on both winning percentage and SOS, but are valued quite a bit lower in NPI, indicating that probably Stevens Point had better wins, or Ohio Northern had worse losses, or a combination of the two, rather than just your aggregated winning percentage and aggregated SOS that is not matching up specific results against opponents, which I bet is why RRO got added in the first place whenever it did.
Yeah, and I think you kind of hit it on the head. I'm not even sure what team you were talking about, but the win-loss percentage, right? Like, if a team was 16-9, you better have some really great results versus ranked and a high SOS, right? Like, and even you know, I would say recently those teams aren't getting talked about very much. You know, it's really hard to sell 10 people sitting on the call when you're getting to the bottom of the pool C's why a team with that winning percentage should be in when they're, you know, because at some point it's not a scheduling contest, right? You got to win those games. And so
Right.
I think teams like that had a harder time getting in the old system.
Yep. Now, I believe I have this. So just like NPI is able to say or make the determination, Wisconsin Stevens Point, you do have a low winning percentage compared to some other teams, but we see lots of really strong wins in there, and they're treated better by NPI than the old system. And this is not to say like there are better or worse decisions that could have been made. It's just these systems are different. But take a team like Merchant Marine. Actually, no, not Merchant Marine. They would have been even higher in the old system with no wins versus region ranked opponents. That is surprising to me. Carnegie Mellon. I'm not finding the type of resume that I was trying to find. I was expecting these low. I guess they are over 800. What would be a... Yeah, so kind of your Hardin Simmons would be a resume that would be valued worse in the old system. So they have some strong wins in there as well. So I think a lot of the times that you're going to be valued lower is because you just don't have a lot of the strong wins. And that's where the quality win bonus comes in. And I would advocate for that multiplier being even higher than 0.6666. I think it could be over 1 because I think it's a lot harder to beat team 1 than team 2 than it is to beat 2 versus 3. And then the gaps steadily get larger the more that you march down. But that benefit, I think the benefit provided there doesn't quite match how hard it is to beat those top teams, but increasing that multiplier would side more towards the teams that have accrued those top wins, even if they haven't accrued as many total wins. Actually, I remember what I was trying to go for Merchant Marine. Merchant Marine is also valued a lot higher by NPI, and it's a totally different kind of resume than, say, Stevens Point. It's almost the opposite one. But NPI is able to say, like, we don't care that you have 0 wins versus region ranked opponents because we can see that you've beaten a lot of teams between 50 or 75 and 200, and you have only 1 loss, actually only 2 losses. And I imagine that would have also been a pretty hard resume to rank under the old system, where if I have to compare Merchant Marine and Ohio Northern, it's going to be very difficult to compare 923, 519 with no wins VRO, and Ohio Northern is 704, 574, 1 win VRO. But MPI is very happily to just churn away on the system. And so I think there is more of a path towards a team more set up to play a weaker schedule like Merchant Marine to get into the tournament than there was previously. Let me check my notes. So the final 5 games, Gettysburg did win, so they should be a top 8 seed. Vassar and Ithaca are underway. So we covered final 5 games, 43 pool A's, 21 pool C's. We can talk real quick about the top 4, 8, and 16. So your top 4. I believe will be Bowdoin, NYU, Scranton, Wallace in that order. Top 8, Bowdoin, NYU, Scranton, Baldwin, Wallace, Whitman, Illinois Wesleyan, Gustavus, Adolphus, and Gettysburg. So I believe that means that Illinois Wesleyan and Gustavus cannot be bracketed in the same quadrant. And then your top 16, I am less sure on this, but I think it goes down through Ohio Wesleyan, and it might have Newport. Nope, Hopkins didn't win. So I think Catholic will be in your 16th spot there, which again does not mean that they will host. We did have another question earlier that I am trying to decipher. There are often, I think they're saying there are often flights in the Sweet 16. Are we back to miles again? I don't know if there was a period of time, Megan, where we didn't have some sort of miles. It was 600 instead of 500 for, I think, one season. But per NCAA regulations, they're on the hook for a flight budget if they bracket up a distance greater than 500 miles. So that is definitely going to be a factor, as it has before. Top 4, top 8, top 16. In the top 16, I would expect that all of them get an opening round host if they have submitted paperwork to do so. East Texas Baptist would be your Texas host. Whitman should be able to host. And there aren't any other complications that I foresee in the top 16. Bethel being in the top 16 might have made it pretty difficult to try to, or Stout, to try to have 3 pods between Gustavus, Bethel, Stout, and Oshkosh. That probably would have been really, really tough to make happen, but Whitewater being from that area and one of the top 16 seeds is easier to bracket than a Stout or a Bethel would have been. And I think Wartburg is close, but I think that that's actually a question I had for the d3hoops.com folks was, do we need 5 Midwest hosts? And if so, Wartburg would be the next one up. And it seems like we shouldn't need 5 Midwest hosts as we have some good Ohio options, but that does not mean that it can't happen.
I was thinking about that. Do you know who I don't even know if we have 4 true 4 seeds in the Midwest, like pod 4 seeds.
We don't really. So let's use Illinois Wesleyan as our search point. We only have one. So Principia, Center, Calvin, Wisconsin Lutheran could be potential ones, but Center is pretty flexible geographically and could be at Baldwin Wallace or something. So, I mean, I don't think it would be bizarre, but DePaul and La Crosse could draw a pod 1 seed in the first round. The Midwest definitely. Wait, why is?
And you have Superior in there as well. That's probably out of mileage for Wesleyan, but that'll be
514 to Wesleyan. Yeah. So if we instead used Whitewater as our search, we have Superior in there as well. So yeah, Superior probably plays Gustavus.
Because I think to get Wartburg at another host in the Midwest the committee would have to be pretty creative to even find a 4 seed we're running out of teams.
Yeah, I would agree. So Gustavus. Really the only seed that can, unless you want to send Wisconsin Lutheran to Gustavus, which you could. I mean, Gustavus is no longer the top seed from this geography. So for that is hosting implications. We talked about the differences from the old system. I'm not going to have good data on the teams that just missed and what could have changed their fortunes. But one thing I did want to talk about is these gaps in MPI are very small. They're down to the thousandths of a decimal spot. But I don't think that means that the system as designed is splitting hairs. I think it just is the way that the math works out, because you are only giving the system wins and losses, 2 options, and then it recurses on itself. So you run MPI for 1 year and get an MPI for everyone, and then you run it again using everyone's now new NPI values from the end of iteration 1 as everyone else's strength of schedule when they play you for iteration 2. And then you do that enough times, there kind of stops being a change in the system. And just because of the way all that works, these gaps are going to be very small between teams. There's no like margin of victory put in here where you can see like, oh, this team won by 80 and a different team beat them by 4. NPI just knows like, hey, you beat them or you lost to them. So I don't think that differences of a thousandth of a point are splitting hairs. And I think this system also lets us see it when every game that happened under the previous system also had a ripple effect through opponents' winning percentage and opponents' winning percentage. We just weren't tracking it down to that level of detail. But looking down towards teams that have just missed, the line's right here below lacrosse. So we're talking 0.18 difference between lacrosse and Mary Hardin Baylor, and 0.21 to Hope. It's probably just one loss flipped into a win, and you can probably find those games for all of those teams. But I think it can make, what do you think? Do you think it can make it feel arbitrary if this system just spits out, I think these teams are different by 17 thousandths of a decimal spot?
It's the same way it was a year ago. If team number 22 won one more game, they're probably in. We just don't have the value behind that.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're muted, Meg.
I think you are muted, Megan.
I was just saying, in a year ago, right? Like for that 21st spot, you're voting, right? Like, and so as much as you can talk about being consistent, like you could be a 6-4 vote for that 21st team. You know what I mean? And 4 people on the committee see it one way and the majority sees it another way. And so, I mean, yeah, it's not a whole lot different, right? Like probably everybody on the board for that final spot a year ago is deserving if you have the right person vocalizing why their resume is better, right?
Yep. And everyone is going to have their own opinion on which teams are actually better and try to find a system that rewards the teams that they think are better the best. And so one thing I'm kind of excited to do in the offseason is I can change these dials to anything. The winning percentage and strength of schedule weight. I can set a quality win multiplier at 5. And it would be curious if people think one thing like, oh, if we change the dial this way, this league's teams are going to be ranked lower. And then we can actually see, is that the case? Because I know that the NESCAC having 5 teams in and potentially 6 with Colby kind of makes you feel like, is there some secret about MPI that is just benefiting them more? And then you go look at all of the results and you're like, oh, Amherst beat like 14 teams in the top 170 and I beat 7. And you can see like, oh, maybe it's rewarding a team that has beat more good teams than I have. Good question here. So NYU gets punished for not having a conference tournament because they played 2 less games. I don't know. I think punished is not the right word because they're in a conference that can pick how they set up their automatic qualifier and conference tournament structure. But it does have a mathematical impact specifically on teams right at the bubble, like WashU, Emory, Chicago. Given 2 more games, and given they play in such a hard conference that it's difficult to win tons of games, a couple extra opportunities to kind of get your top 15 wins as strong as possible is probably a disadvantage that the UAA has because of their structure. And it's going to be similar to Region 10 teams who can't fill their or have difficulties filling their schedule full. I think one thing the NESCAC has shown us is that more choice means more opportunities to make decisions that help your team. And so the NESCAC having the single round robin, it's less that, you don't have to play your conference mates a second time. It's that they have the flexibility of getting to schedule more non-conference games. And they then schedule good teams and schedule in ways that help themselves. That's going to be similar. So the UAA teams just have 2 fewer opportunities, but I bet you I could go through all of their non-conference schedules, and they did not all book the same type of non-conference schedule. And so your choice is going to be important. Looks like we've got Riley here as well. Hi, Riley, with some sketchy Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I think we'll see how long I can last on here, but we wanted to make a quick appearance, and it looks like y'all are rolling along. So finally got done with the SCAC final here in Dallas.
Thanks, Riley. We were just talking about the small differences in MPI. We haven't gotten a whole lot more questions about where teams might go. But this is I'm not gonna zoom down far enough to get all 64 teams, but this is kind of my rough viewing guide or rough order guide for potential seeds. So if your team is up here, these are going to be the rough types of areas that they're around. Does not mean that if you're a 4, you're guaranteed to meet a 5, or 6 guaranteed to meet a 3. But if you're a 4, you're probably not going to be playing a 2 or a 1, potentially in the second round. I believe Stout did move ahead of Elizabethtown 1 spot because Calvin won. But they're all still on the 6 line. And then our lowest pool C would be La Crosse, about a 12 seed. That feels right. Usually it's about the 10 or 11 seed in the D1 tournaments that are the last at larges, I believe.
It will be really fascinating how the bracket's put together with this additional information due to MPI. Because like we talked about earlier, we just had a lot more flexibility to create I would say, interesting bracket, right? Like new matchups and those kinds of things. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the committee goes with this additional information.
Because it probably was interviews of yours on Hoopsville, Megan, where you were talking about looking at old tournaments or recent tournaments and wanting to either bring back a matchup from the COVID year or around then, or not have the exact same matchup year after year. I think that sort of flexibility, like the brackets always, at least for the last couple of years that I followed it closely, were always really, really good. They looked really interesting. They looked like they mixed the regions. I think last year's bracket had some flights baked into the sectionals that we weren't expecting, but it created some really exciting bracketing possibilities there. And I can definitely see that going away.
Yeah, like I think the Gustavus Superior matchup's boring. Like I get it, that's how the numbers match up, but that can happen non-conference every year.
Yep.
So it'll be. I was teasing the committee. I was going to try to pick their bracket, see what they were going to do.
It's not terribly more exciting to send Superior to any of Oshkosh, Whitewater, or Wartburg.
Yeah.
But
no, it's not. And you're going to have some of that, I guess. But
that upper Midwest is tough this year with looks like 5 WIAC teams plus Gustavus and Bethel. I think someone counted 8 Wisconsin teams.
Yeah, so I think that's what I was going to ask. What was that on your tweet? That's a lot.
An eighth of the tournament is from Wisconsin. Oh, that does remind me. I put together, which I think this is now fully accurate, of the field of 64, just where all of the teams are. And to kind of I don't always look at a map of the United States, but it shows you where lots and lots of Division III schools are and where lots of Division III schools aren't. Because I guess it's hard with only one from Washington and one from California. But I bet if you split the country up into regions and saw the percentage of tournament teams relative to the percentage of Division III schools in each of the regions, it would be pretty similar across the regions. It's just that there's so few schools west of Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, compared to that Northeast. But I really do hope that they give Whitman a host. I think there are ways to spend one less flight by not doing that. But I would really hope that Whitman can host. You probably haven't tuned in for the bulk of this, Riley, but were there any burning questions that you had for either Justin or Megan?
I was able to tune into a little bit of it, Scott. I think you covered a lot of really good stuff there that gives insight to some people. I think just looking at this, though, it's an interesting, just to comment on the map there. I think, you look at a lot of these RAQs, but there's also, like, if you break down the at-large teams, it's again, very similar. That's where the majority of Division III is coming from. But I am interested to see, to your point on Whitman, kind of the way that they end up deciding to do that. Because I don't know the last time that a Region 10, even if we were looking at sectionals, because I know I've gotten some questions about that. I don't think that's likely at all. But I don't know the last time a Region 10 hosted a sectionals. I know we were talking about that a couple of years ago. So it'll be interesting to see the way that they handle Whitman, a team that has a really strong resume, ranks high in MPI, but is so isolated, with the NWC, being a one bid league, obviously the SCIAC being a one bid league as well. And then just 3 out of Texas. That bracketing aspect will be interesting to watch for tomorrow.
And the additional support from the champs committee gave committees flexibility to protect the top 4. Is that right?
This year?
Yeah.
I am not sure.
I thought there was additional budget support put towards the championships for that this year to help. We had the issue with Trine last year, obviously going to Whitewater on that weekend. And, it was something that obviously the committee asked for because it would have created a flight for Stout, I believe.
Yep.
But I thought with the additional support, I thought there was going to be a little bit more flexibility in protecting those top 4 this year. So, like, if it was this year, Trine would have hosted and Stout would have flown, but maybe I'm wrong.
Transylvania.
Not Trine.
Yeah. Because
Right.
it was one extra flight to have Transylvania host. Yeah. And I mean, there's probably a good way to write however it got written. But you could run into a situation where the committee then is always bracketing, knowing that they have some extra.
Gotta push the envelope a little bit, right?
But the ideal is that if that situation arises where I believe Stout was the 3rd highest seed in their pod and they got through, and that was the one scenario that Transylvania was not going to host, it was clear that quadrant had been laid out for them to host if any of the scenarios involving chalk happened, and we just happened to get the 3rd best team in a pod, it's going to be unavoidable. There was one involving Scranton and someone else up in the Northeast that would have been a similar result of a lower seed hosting that sectional if a Sweet 16 if a round of 32 result went a different way, just because you can't guarantee it for the top host for all possible outcomes. There was one more. Oh, okay. We had a comment here. I like that head-to-head isn't given so much weight within a region. In prior years, it was almost impossible to jump someone that you lost to. I obviously don't need specifics, but is that something that you kind of encountered, Justin, where that was a largely prioritized item often?
A little bit. I think once you got down to like trying to find ways to differentiate teams, that was the tip of the cap where when things were really, really close. I think when the gap got big enough, like I don't know what you're looking at, lacrosse or something like that, there was never a value on,
right,
when that line was crossed or not, but a good discussion.
I have not gotten this comment, but I'm anticipating it from someone at some point, is that, you could look at two teams rated very close to one another in NPI. I don't know who would be, maybe Ohio Northern and Capital. And you could say, oh, Capital had a better head-to-head record against Ohio Northern this year. How on earth are they behind them? When in reality, NPI has counted that. It has factored in that you beat them. And it's just that, and that these two teams are as close as they are is because they won head to head. I think the old system was hard to show to every committee or every rack. Like, this is how you've actually valued these pieces of data, when a win over a specific team is part of your winning percentage, it's part of your strength of schedule. It probably is part of your RO. It's probably part of common and head to head. Well, it's not part of common. And like, I've run into this before when I'm devising new baseball statistics, combining slugging percentage and on-base percentage and doubles percentage. And then if I actually break it down to the individual components, I might see something like, oh, I'm valuing doubles 7 times as much as I'm valuing triples, but I didn't realize that because I was lumping together already kind of aggregated statistics. And I think that was something that, if you had teams that are close in the old system, we're humans and have to differentiate between them. And so head-to-head seems like a darn good thing to differentiate between them. And we don't have the ability to see like, oh, this is how that result is already incorporated in the stuff that caused them to be close in the first place. And I think that's one of the biggest things I've seen in MPI is that because it's so hard to compare apples to oranges type teams, if you were if you had a more balanced resume, it ended up valuing you higher than if you had one of the either extreme types of resumes, just because it's so hard to compare. But because NPI is looking at everything on a game level, it has no problem making that callous comparison by itself.
Riley, 2014 Whitman hosted sectionals. That was the last time, I think.
2014. So a decade. Yeah. I have no idea if this would ever fly budget wise, but I think for the increased health of the Division III landscape, guaranteeing a sectional to Region 10 once every, I don't know what the cadence is, 10 years, 8 years, could be really cool. There's probably lots of administrative problems about how do you select which of those 8, 10, 12 years it happens, but there have definitely been teams that have been worthy, but it just didn't make sense budget-wise because of all the extra flights. All right. I think we've run out of things that we need to specifically talk about because the field is unofficially known with no more bid thieves today. I am going to rerun NPI and rerun the simulations here shortly, but that is what I'm expecting. And tomorrow we will be talking about the bracket once we know what the bracket is. I am not very good at bracketing. I don't think Riley has tried his hand at bracketing very much. And so we will be looking at anything that d3hoops.com is producing or anything that Matt Snyder is producing leading up to the official bracket reveal tomorrow at 2:30. We are planning to be talking about that at 3:30. And I don't have any good way to wrap this up. But thanks to Justin for being on the show for the second time, our most prolific guest. And good to meet you, Megan, and for being on the show. Looks like Riley has dropped off, but it is always fun to talk Division III women's basketball, and this year was very exciting with more bid thieves than I was expecting, which did end up hurting hope this year, but just goes to show how exciting conference tournament weekend is. And thanks to everyone who has tuned in either live or in the future. And we will catch you later.
Bye.